When the first explosion echoed across the frozen outskirts of the Russian base, nobody on the ground understood what had happened. Soldiers rushed out of barracks, alarms began to scream, and dust drifted through the cold air. But above the clouds, invisible to every radar for almost 8 minutes, a single Ukrainian jet was already turning away, engines roaring like a ghost that struck without ever being seen. This was not just another sortie in the long, grinding conflict. This was something different. A strike so precise, so unexpected, that even Russian military analysts spent days arguing about what hit them. And this is the story of how a daring Ukrainian pilot, flying an aging but heavily modified combat jet, pulled off one of the most unbelievable hits of the war. A strike that forced Russia to rethink everything it believed about the security of its rear bases, and a strike that nearly didn't happen at all. The mission began long before the jet ever took off. Deep inside a dimly lit Ukrainian planning room, officers studied satellite photos of a Russian base located dozens of kilometers behind enemy lines. It was a hardened target, heavily guarded, protected by layered missile defense systems, with patrol routes constantly shifting. It wasn't the kind of place Ukraine usually targeted with jets. In fact, going anywhere near this base was considered nearly suicidal. The Russian air defense umbrella around it was designed to detect anything larger than a drone the moment it left Ukrainian airspace. But the base was storing something too dangerous to ignore. Intelligence reports revealed newly supplied missiles, fuel depots, and mobile radar trucks that were preparing to move closer to the front. If Ukraine allowed them to deploy, thousands of civilians and soldiers could be at risk. That left only one question: how to hit a target protected by some of the densest air defenses in Europe. The answer came from a combination of old technology and new improvisation. Engineers had spent months modifying a Ukrainian jet to carry advanced standoff munitions. It wasn't built for stealth, but it was fast, rugged, and deadly when flown by the right hands. And the pilot selected for this mission was known for one thing: flying low. So low that he could skim the ground, dipping into valleys and terrain folds, hiding from radar as if the earth itself were his shield. On the morning of the strike, the pilot walked toward his aircraft in near silence. His crew checked fuel lines, weapons mounts, and the targeting system while frost formed on the metal. There was no room for error. The jet would fly alone. No escort, no decoys, no second chance. If the Russians detected him, he would be shot down within minutes. Everyone on the ground knew this. Everyone except the pilot, who simply climbed into the cockpit as if this was routine. At takeoff, the sky was gray, heavy, and cold. Perfect weather for what he needed to do. The jet rose for only a moment before dropping sharply, hugging the terrain as it shot forward like a blade slicing through the wind. He flew so low that villagers later reported hearing a roar but never seeing the aircraft. Trees rushed beneath him, rivers flashed by like streaks of silver, and every rise in the land became part of his camouflage. Russian radar operators saw nothing. As he crossed the invisible line between safe airspace and danger, the real test began. Russian early warning systems scanned constantly, but they were angled upward, searching for threats at conventional altitude. The jet was flying so low that the radar waves passed right over it. Even then, the mission was hanging by a thread. A single mistake, a slight climb, a moment of hesitation, would expose him instantly. Back at the Russian base, soldiers were performing routine tasks. Fuel trucks moved between storage tanks. A small convoy prepared to offload crates. A radar dish slowly rotated, humming as it searched the empty sky. They believed the front lines were far away. They believed they were safe. They were wrong. As the Ukrainian jet neared the launch point, the terrain leveled out. This was the most dangerous moment. To fire his weapon, the pilot needed altitude, just enough to lock onto the target. Climbing even for a few seconds could expose him to Russian radar. He steadied his breathing, checked his instruments, and pulled back on the stick. The jet rose. 20 meters. 50. 70. On the Russian radar screens, a single blip appeared at the edge of detection. At first, operators thought it was interference. Then the blip sharpened. Alarms activated. They attempted to classify the threat, but it was already too late. The Ukrainian pilot heard the tone in his headset. Target lock. He squeezed the trigger. The missile dropped, ignited, and streaked toward the Russian base at incredible speed. By the time Russian air defense crews reacted, the missile was seconds from impact. They launched interceptors, but the angle was wrong, the timing too short. The weapon hit the base with a thunderous explosion that shook the ground for kilometers. Inside the base, everything descended into chaos. A fuel tanker was engulfed instantly, sending fire rolling across the yard like a wave. Crates detonated one after another, sending shrapnel cutting through vehicles and structures. Communications fell silent. Soldiers scrambled for cover as secondary explosions ripped through ammunition stores. A radar truck tilted sideways and collapsed as flames consumed its tires. Within minutes, the entire base looked like a burning crater. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian pilot was already diving back down, picking up speed. The Russians, now fully alert, began firing blindly into the sky. Missiles arced upward, searching for a target that was no longer there. The jet weaved through the landscape, engines screaming as it raced toward safety. One missile locked onto him briefly, but terrain masking broke the signal. Another exploded behind him, close enough to rattle the canopy but not close enough to bring him down. He didn't look back. He knew his mission was done. For 30 long minutes, Ukrainian command waited for any sign, radio contact, a blip on friendly radar, anything. At one point, officers feared the worst. Then a voice crackled through the static. The pilot was alive. He had crossed the safe line. The room erupted. The strike had succeeded, and the jet had survived one of the most dangerous flights of the war. News of the explosion spread across Russian channels within hours. At first, officials described it as an accidental fire. Then video footage emerged showing the plume of smoke rising high into the sky. Satellite photos followed. Analysts identified destroyed fuel depots, damaged radar equipment, and vehicles reduced to melted frames. It became impossible to hide what had happened. The strike didn't just destroy equipment. It exposed a deep weakness in Russian defenses. If a single Ukrainian jet could penetrate that far, what else could Ukraine hit? What other bases were vulnerable? The psychological impact was enormous. Russian commanders were forced to reposition assets, increase patrols, and divert resources to protect deeper territories. The ripple effect influenced strategic decisions for weeks. But while the world focused on the destruction, few realized how close the mission came to failing. Days later, the pilot revealed that during the escape, one of his warning lights indicated a possible engine issue. If it had worsened, he would have been forced to eject behind enemy lines. He admitted feeling fear, but only after reaching safety. During the flight, he had no time for anything except survival and precision. Ukraine later released a short statement confirming the operation but withheld details about the aircraft, the weapon, and the exact route. Russia continued to blame sabotage or accidents, refusing to acknowledge that a Ukrainian jet had pierced its defenses. But independent analysts reached the same conclusion: the strike was deliberate, professional, and executed with almost impossible skill. In the days that followed, Russian bases shifted into high alert. Air defenses were reconfigured. Patrol aircraft flew more frequently. But the psychological damage had already been done. A single daring strike had proven that distance was no longer a guarantee of safety. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, the pilot returned quietly to his squadron. He avoided interviews, avoided publicity, and went back to working on his aircraft with the ground crew. To him, the mission was not about fame. It was about doing what had to be done to protect his country. Weeks later, intelligence confirmed that the destruction at the Russian base had delayed the deployment of long-range missiles that could have targeted Ukrainian cities. The strike may have saved countless lives. It was a reminder that in war, sometimes the most critical battles are fought far from the front, in the shadows, by individuals whose names the world may never know. Today, military analysts still study the mission. They examine the flight path, the timing, the daring climb for the missile launch, and the escape that followed. Some call it one of the boldest air operations of the conflict. Others refer to it as a miracle of precision flying. But all agree on one thing: it changed the strategic landscape. The story continues to echo across both nations, one side calling it a heroic act of survival and resistance, the other side struggling to explain how it happened. And the pilot, whose calm courage made it possible, remains a symbol of how determination, skill, and risk can alter the course of history in a single moment. Long after the smoke cleared, long after the fires burned out and the ruins cooled, one truth remained. A single jet, flown by a single man, had crossed the impossible, and walked through the fire to strike at the heart of an enemy who believed they were untouchable. And that is what happened when a Ukrainian jet struck a Russian base, and everything changed.